That is the sound of 37-year-old James Allen, a man who has just placed a frantic 911 call. He's in his basement, performing CPR on his unresponsive wife, Amy. When the first officer arrives at the home, it's eerily silent. But as soon as James hears the officer announce himself, he begins to wail. He's found sobbing, grieving, and continuing his life-saving efforts. He rips his shirt off in a dramatic display of grief, but officers notice his behavior is strange. He alternates between complete composure and wild emotional outbursts. And then, the most chilling moment of all. An EMT emerges from the basement with a glimmer of hope. His wife is still clinging to life. But when James realizes that his wife is still breathing, his reaction, captured by officers, is not relief. It's a flash of pure, unmistakable frustration. What kind of husband is upset that his wife is still alive? This is a story of a secret, double life. A husband obsessed with control, and a set of text messages that would light the fuse for a terrible, final act. It's a case the investigators had to solve with a scientific experiment. You are not going to want to miss this. If you're ready, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories, and let's get started. The call came through on a line reserved for the desperate. It was 18 minutes past the point of no return when the 37-year-old man, James Allen, placed his call to 911. The dispatcher heard the practiced, calm greeting of the police department receiver. Police department, police department. And then the caller's voice broke through the line. "Hello." "Yes," the man said, his voice thick and strained. "This is 37-year-old Jimmy Allen." The dispatcher, accustomed to panic, waited. "Okay. What's going on there?" "She's in the basement," he said, the words tumbling out. "Pulled her up. I tried to give her CPR. The dispatcher's training took over. She gave the man, James, instructions to continue giving Amy CPR. She told him that several units were being rushed to the scene." The desperation in his voice was a sound she had heard many times before, yet there was something else beneath it, a frantic quality that felt almost rehearsed. Officer Ben J. Horn was the first to arrive at the residence. He had heard the desperation on the radio, the report of a man trying to save his wife. He was prepared for noise, for chaos, for screams. He found only silence. As Officer Horn approached the residence, it was eerily silent. There was no sound from the open doorway. No crying, no shouting. Just a heavy, unnatural stillness that made the air feel cold and wrong. He stepped across the threshold, his training screaming at him that the silence did not match the call. It was only as soon as the officer made himself known, his voice sharp and official, that the spell was broken. "Police department," he announced. A wail erupted from below. "Police department. Hello. Help." Yes, it was James. The desperate voice from the phone had returned, now performing for a live audience. Horn followed the sound down, into the basement, where he found James sobbing over his unresponsive wife's body. James was, as instructed, still performing CPR, his movements rhythmic and labored. "How long's she been down? Do you have any idea?" Horn asked, his voice cutting through the man's cries. James shook his head, his grief looking almost convulsive. "It can't be more than about 20 minutes, he choked out. "Okay." Horn's gaze dropped to the woman, Amy. He was looking for signs, for the story of what had happened in this quiet place. He looked for trauma, for injury, for any visible reason she would be unresponsive. Oddly enough, Amy didn't have any significant injuries. She was still, but there was nothing that screamed of an accident. Then he saw it. It was faint, almost invisible. A very faint mark near her jugular. It was not the kind of mark he would expect. It was subtle, and it made the hairs on his arms stand up. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and by 8:57 p.m., the basement was no longer quiet. More officers arrived, piling into the space along with several EMTs. They moved with professional urgency, taking over the life-saving efforts from James. The moment the EMTs touched Amy, James's role changed. Now that he had a moment to process, to be the grieving husband, he seemed to collapse. He dramatically ripped his shirt off his own body, the sound of the fabric tearing in the crowded space. He broke down on the basement floor, a portrait of overwhelming grief. But Horn watched him. The performance was jarring. Just as quickly as the breakdown had begun, James was able to compose himself. He sat up, his sobs quieting, and he continued to observe the imps as they aided Amy. He was a man switching masks. Horn noted how James alternated between complete composure and these wild, emotional outbursts, a back and forth that happened several times. "You want to come upstairs with me real quick?" another officer asked, gesturing him away from the scene. "Okay," James said, his voice suddenly calm, all trace of hysteria gone. As you can see, James seemed calm as he walked up the basement stairs. He was composed, thoughtful, following the officer's direction. He entered the kitchen, a different space, a different stage. And then, as he entered the kitchen, he unleashed his wrath. It was not at an officer or at the wall. He unleashed it onto an unsuspecting bowl of potato chips. He smashed his hand into it, a bizarre, violent, and completely baffling act. The officers weren't sure what to make of this erratic behavior. They were there for a medical emergency, but the scene was wrong. The silence was wrong. The faint mark was wrong. And the man in the kitchen, smashing a bowl of chips after ripping his shirt off, was the most wrong of all. They had no clue what had led up to the discovery of Amy's body, but the investigation had already begun. The sound of the bowls smashing on the kitchen floor had been sharp, a violent percussion that left a sudden, ringing silence in its wake. Potato chips were scattered across the linoleum, a mundane mess created by an inexplicable act of rage. James stood breathing heavily, his bare chest rising and falling, his hands clenched. The officers watched him. They had seen grief, they had seen panic, but this was something else. This was a performance, and the actor was dangerously off script. "Did she make any statements at all?" Officer Horn asked, his voice deliberately calm, trying to pull the man back from the strange precipice he was on. James seemed to shudder, the rage draining from him as quickly as it had arrived. He composed himself, his face smoothing over, becoming the concerned husband once more. No, nothing," he said, shaking his head. He gave the officers a quick summary, his voice now steady, almost rehearsed. He told them about their night. He spoke of around 6:30 p.m., when he and Amy had dropped their daughter and her friend off at a nearby high school football game. He told them they had then headed downtown for some drinks. He detailed the bar, the argument. He said Amy had ended up walking home alone while he drove home in their car. When Amy got back home, he said, the arguing continued. He claimed he left her alone to cool off, that he went upstairs and threw on the Jim Carrey film Ace Ventura. It was all so specific, so detailed. He said when it was time to pick up their daughter, he went to check on Amy again. It was like irritated, and I didn't hear anything. So I went back down to check on her. The officers listened. It was a neat story, but it felt hollow. "Does Amy have a history of anything like this?" an officer asked. "Nothing," James said, his voice rising, emphatic. "Nothing in her background at all. Ever. Okay." He was selling it hard. The officers found it strange that a woman with no history, no issues, would suddenly escalate things to this degree out of nowhere. But nobody seemed as shocked as James. He leaned against the counter, his performance of the devastated husband back in full force. I'm hoping I wake up, dude," he whispered, his head in his hands. Unfortunately for James, this was a nightmare that he wouldn't be waking up from. But the nightmare was about to change. Suddenly, an empt emerged from the basement, his face set. He looked past the officers, directly at James. He carried with him a glimmer of hope, a development that should have been a miracle. "Huh," James said, looking up, his face a mask of confusion. "What?" The empt's voice was clear in the quiet kitchen. "Says she's fighting." The words hung in the air. She's fighting. The emps had been able to re-establish a faint pulse. Amy was still clinging to life. A profound, suffocating silence filled the room. The officers turned to look at James, expecting an explosion of joy, of relief, of tears, a genuine, uncontrolled reaction. They saw none of it. When James realized that his wife was still breathing, his face did not register relief. For one unguarded second, a flash of pure, unadulterated frustration passed across his features. His jaw tightened. His eyes, for just a moment, looked not like a grieving husband's, but like a man whose careful plans had just been completely, infuriatingly, undone. The promising news was, to him, a disaster. His reaction immediately set off red flags for the officers. It was a tiny, fractional moment, but it was louder than the smashed bowl, louder than his sobs in the basement. This man did not want his wife to be alive. Sensing the shift in the room, the sudden weight of their suspicion, James seemed to break the spell. He gestured to his bare chest, to the ripped shirt on the floor. I need a shirt," he stammered, leaving the room momentarily. He needed to reset. He needed a new costume. When he came back, wearing a fresh shirt, his composure was back. But the officers were no longer watching a victim. They were watching a suspect. James pulled out his phone. He called his daughter, Ashley, to inform her of the emergency. His voice was a marvel of control. "We had an emergency," he said, calm and paternal. "Don't go anywhere. There's an emergency. Don't go anywhere. I'll talk to you in a little bit." He didn't want Ashley to panic over the phone, he explained. He kept his composure and didn't share any details of what had happened. He was the protective father. But right after that phone call, he dialed another number. His parents. The mask changed again. Instantly, he was the broken son. "I don't know what to do, Mom," he cried into the phone, his voice cracking. "I don't know what to do. This is terrible. I got to talk to the cops." He was spilling his heart out, the picture of a man destroyed by tragedy. But Officer Horn, watching him closely, spotted the final, damning detail. Although James was crying his heart out, the officer spotted no moisture on his face at all. The sobs were dry. The grief was hollow. The officers exchanged a look. They decided to have him wait outside, away from the crime scene. A moment later, Amy was placed on a stretcher, a living, breathing miracle, and taken to the back of an ambulance. She was rushed to the Promedica Herrick Hospital, just 2 minutes away. As the ambulance pulled away, James stood on the lawn, finally alone, his performance for the night at an end. Or so he thought. The red and white lights of the ambulance disappeared down the street, their wail fading into the cold night. The sudden silence that returned to the residence was heavy, no longer the eerie quiet Officer Horn had first discovered, but the thick, weighted silence of a place that was now a scene. James was still outside, a solitary figure instructed to wait, his face a careful mask of shock. The officers left him there. His performance was over, and theirs was just beginning. With the emergency medical technicians finished in the basement, Horn and his partner headed back inside. The kitchen was still a minor chaos of potato chips and the lingering energy of James's strange rage. They bypassed it, their boots heavy on the stairs as they descended back into the space where Amy had been found. Now, the dust had settled. The frantic energy of the life-saving efforts was gone. There was no medical equipment, no desperate CPR. There was only the room and the story it was trying to tell. It was a story that immediately contradicted the one they had heard from the man waiting outside. Horn walked to the spot where Amy had been. He looked at the floor, then at the items nearby. He saw the object James had mentioned in his frantic, contradictory story, the upturned kitty litter pail. He stood over it. He was a tall man, but the detail had been lost in the chaos. Now, in the quiet, he looked up. The basement ceilings were very low. He held his hand out, palm flat, just above his head. He didn't need a tape measure. He knew. "Ben," his partner said, his voice quiet. He was standing a few feet away, doing the same thing. "You see it," Horn said. It wasn't a question. Amy, they had been told, was 5'6". The basement ceiling wasn't much higher, roughly 7 feet. Horn did the math in his head. He looked at the upturned pail. He looked at the mark he had seen on Amy, the faint, subtle line near her jugular. He looked at the space. The logistics were wrong. The story James had told, the story of a desperate, sudden act, required space. It required leverage. It required a specific set of physics that this room, this tiny, compressed space, did not allow. His partner walked over, pointing. With the pail, her feet would have made contact with the ground. They would have touched, Horn affirmed. The two officers stood in the low-ceilinged room for a long moment, the faint mark on Amy's neck, the one that wasn't a deep, abrasive injury. The man upstairs who smashed a chip bowl when he heard his wife was fighting, the dry sobs into the phone. And now, the room itself. The physical evidence was screaming, and it was saying James's story was an impossibility. They were not jumping to conclusions. They were professional. They were methodical. But the narrative had shifted. This was no longer a tragic call. This was an investigation. They decided to wrap things up for the night. They carefully collected the items, the extension cord, the pail. They were no longer household objects. They were evidence. They ascended the stairs, their steps firm. They walked through the kitchen and out the front door, past the man who was still playing the part of the grieving husband. James watched them, his face pale, perhaps believing his story had been accepted. The officers did not look back. They left him in the silence, now armed with the room's own terrible testimony. The next morning, Officer Horn and his partner returned. The harsh light of the new day did nothing to warm the atmosphere of the Allen household. It was a place of meticulous order, a home where everything seemed to have a designated spot. James greeted them, his composure from the night before now settled, hardened, as if he had rehearsed for this, his second act. His grief was now a quiet, managed thing. They had returned with a new purpose. The night before had been about the act itself. Today was about the prelude. They hoped to get a better understanding of what had led up to the incident. They sat with James, a notebook open, a pen poised. "Walk us through yesterday," Horn said, his voice even. From the beginning, James nodded, eager to help, to paint the picture. According to James, the family had started their day in high spirits. He spoke of making breakfast together. He mentioned their daughter, Ashley, listening to music and making lunch and breakfast, smile on her face. He detailed the mundane schedule of a happy, normal family. At around 7:30 in the morning, James left for work and Ashley left for school. Amy, he said, stayed home. He then mentioned that he had decided to leave work early. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, he came home and took a nap. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the school day was over, and it was time to pick up Ashley. Ashley had a friend over, Kayla, after school, James recounted, his memory sharp. Amy picked her up, and I was just kind of in bed, and they came here. She made everybody dinner. 6:30, we rolled out to take them to the game. It was a perfect, seamless narrative. A story of a functional, content family. Too content, perhaps. The officers let the silence sit for a moment before Horn asked the question that hung in the air. "Were there any problems, James? Any signs?" James looked up, his face a mask of profound, almost offended confusion. "You know," he said, "spent all night just kind of thinking and playing back. What was? What triggered what? Has she ever tried anything like this before?" "Never," James said, the word sharp. "Never had any. Ever. Like, we live a healthy lifestyle. We work out. We go rock climbing 3 times a week in Ann Arbor." He was on a roll now, building the walls of his perfect life, brick by meticulous brick. "We cook meals at home. We grow our own vegetables out here." "Money trouble?" his partner asked. James almost laughed. "No, I mean, this is like the pinnacle of my, best job I've ever had. I make great money." And then he defined his wife's role within this perfect structure. She's a stay-at-home mom. Takes care of the 5 cats, the pool, and is there for my daughter doing sports and activities. Sure, the officers heard the words. It was a portrait of success, of health, of stability. Yet, the house felt cold, The story, so polished and so free of any human friction, felt hollow. It was the pinnacle of his life. But they were there to find out why it had been the end of hers. "We'd like to do a more thorough search of the home, with your permission," Horn said. James agreed without hesitation. He was the picture of cooperation. The officers, with the help of a new recruit, Louis, James's cat, who followed them with a quiet curiosity, scoured every room in the household. They were not looking for a weapon. They were looking for any clues that could explain last night's incident. They weren't able to find any bombshell evidence, no note, no diary left open. But they did collect several items that belonged to Amy. They took her computer. They took her cell phone. They were taking the pieces of her life that James had not curated for them. Following their search, Officer Horn headed back outside. He needed to speak with Ashley. She was visibly shaken up by the incident. Her grief felt different from her father's. It was quiet, brittle, and real. The detectives needed to know if Amy and James had a history of violent altercations. "Were your mom and dad fighting at all yesterday, that you recall?" Horn asked gently. Ashley hesitated, her eyes dropping. "No," she said. Then she added, "But everything was normal when I left. When you left." "Okay, but everything was normal." It was a strange qualifier. "Is there a history of them, like fighting or arguing or anything like that?" "Nothing ever." "Okay," she said. The answer quick, clipped, and final. It was the same answer her father had given. It was the family line. The officer also asked about Amy's state of mind. Ashley said that even though her mom was a deeply introverted person, she had always been emotionally stable. The interview wasn't as fruitful as the officers had hoped. The daughter, like the father, was sticking to the script. The family was perfect. The life was healthy. The home was stable. The officers left carrying Amy's computer and her phone. They left the cold, perfect house behind. They had James's story. Now, they hoped, they held Amy's. The officers had left the cold house, but the perfect, sterile story they had been told by James and his daughter, Ashley, followed them back. It was a narrative without friction, a life without problems. It was a brick wall. They had Amy's computer and her phone, but they had no key, no crack in the facade to look through. They did not have to wait long. Shortly after they had concluded their interview with Ashley, they were approached by several of Amy's family members. They were not there to offer condolences. They were there to offer an alternative history. The first piece of information they provided landed like a stone, shattering the polished image of the grieving husband. James, they said, had waited 14 hours to tell them about the incident. 14 hours. While Amy was fighting for her life, while her faint pulse was being reestablished, the man who had ripped his shirt off in performative grief had not bothered to call her parents, her mother, her son. As soon as they heard the news, not from James, but through other channels, they rushed over to the police department. They did not come with questions. They came with answers. They said, had an abundance of useful information for the police. The floodgates opened, and a new portrait of Amy's life, and James's, emerged. The investigators learned that Amy's life had not been the simple, linear story James had implied. Back in 1997, when Amy was just 13, she had a son named Caleb. Her parents had looked after Caleb while she, a child herself, attended high school in Ocala, Florida. By the end of high school, she began dating James. He was charming, ambitious, and, on the surface, perfect. He had no problem, they said, becoming a father figure to Caleb. When Amy was 19, they had Ashley. And from that point on, Amy stayed home to take care of the kids while James worked. This was a key part of James's perfect story. His wife, the stay-at-home mom, tending to the pool and the cats. But according to Amy's family, this wasn't her choice. They believed, they knew, that James was a controlling husband. He did not want Amy to become financially independent. He did not want her to have a life outside of the one he built, the one he could see. He would, they claimed, monitor everything the family did. He tracked their social media activity. He even monitored what they were eating throughout the day. His pursuit of a healthy lifestyle was not about health, it was about command. He would also discipline the kids if he believed they were misbehaving. And, the family said, he frequently took things too far. Whenever Amy stood up to James, her opinion didn't seem to matter. Her voice was an inconvenience. The family was clear on this point. Whatever Jimmy wanted, Jimmy got. The control had a breaking point. When Caleb, Amy's son, turned 17, he left. He went to stay with his grandparents, Amy's parents. James, they said, retaliated. But his anger was not directed at the boy who left. It was directed at the woman who stayed. He told Amy that she was no longer allowed to speak with her family, not her parents, who had raised her son, and not her son, Caleb, himself. He had systematically, and with devastating precision, isolated her. One of the last times Caleb saw her, his own mother, was at his high school graduation, a year before the incident. But other than that, Amy, the woman who was a mother at 13, had minimal involvement in Caleb's life. Not by her choice, by her husband's decree. All of this evidence was extremely damning for James. The brick wall of the perfect family had crumbled. It wouldn't be a surprise, the officers now realized, if an abusive and controlling husband, a man who would cut a woman off from her own child, would try to silence her for good. The detectives now had two conflicting narratives. The first was from James, a sterile, polished story of a perfect life, a story that was crumbling under its own impossible weight. The second was from Amy's family, a dark, chilling tale of isolation and retaliation, of a man who demanded absolute control. But the family's story, as damning as it was still hearsay. They needed something from Amy herself. They needed a voice from the woman who was now lying in a hospital bed, unresponsive, unable to tell them what had happened in that low-ceiling basement. They turned to the evidence they had collected from the cold house. They turned to Amy's cell phone. They began with the conversation that was most obvious, her texts with James. As they scrolled, the abstract claims of Amy's family snapped into sharp digital focus. His controlling behavior was on full display. It was not just an accusation, it was a daily reality. He had somehow been tracking Amy's every move. The texts were a relentless barrage of interrogation. He would frequently text Amy her exact location, a street, a shop, followed by the cold, simple question, "Why are you there?" He monitored her time. He monitored her movements. He monitored her existence. This was not the communication of a loving husband. It was the ledger of an auditor. And yet, despite all of James's torment, Amy's responses seemed calm. This evidence strengthened the case against James, but the detectives still couldn't pinpoint an exact motive for an act so final. What was the trigger? What had happened on that specific night? That was when they looked through a conversation with a man named George. They had expected to find a woman completely broken by her husband's control, isolated, as James had insisted, with no friends and no capacity to connect. They found the opposite. They found a secret world. George was a married man from the East Coast that Amy had met online. The conversation, they saw, had been going on for the past 3 years. 3 years of daily, constant communication. Based on the explicit content of the messages, it was clear that they were having an affair. This was not a simple, introverted woman who took care of the cats in the pool. This was a woman living a parallel life, a life of profound emotional depth and intimate connection right under her husband's nose. The detectives scrolled, and a new theory emerged, one that felt cold and sharp and true. Even on the day of the incident, Amy and George were consistently texting and calling each other. She was texting him while she was having that last perfect dinner with her family. At 5:07 in the evening, George had texted her, "I wish we could be together right now." At 5:29 in the evening, Amy had responded with, "I'm excited to see you again." And then, the final, crucial piece. The officers remembered James's story, the story of the argument at the bar. The story of Amy becoming dismissive, of her texting somebody on her phone. The detectives looked at the timestamps. Remember when Amy began texting somebody during the argument at JR's grill and pub? It turns out that she was texting George, even with James sitting directly beside her. Perhaps, the detectives realized, James had caught a glimpse. Perhaps, after years of meticulous, suffocating control, he had looked over and seen the words on her screen. He would have seen, in that one instant, that his perfect, controlled wife was not his at all. He would have seen that she was excited to see another man. The motive was no longer missing. It was right there, in glowing, undeniable text. It was the discovery. It was the ultimate, final loss of control. The detectives had uncovered the motive. Now, as they scrolled through the 3-year history between Amy and George, they began to understand the woman James had tried to erase. The woman he had described as an introverted, socially anxious person with no friends, a person who didn't seem to have the capacity for an affair, was not the woman on this phone. The woman in these messages was alive. She was witty, she was desired, and she was in love. For the most part, George and Amy communicated through text and video calls. It was a lifeline. They talked, as George would later confirm, about life. About everything. It was a space where Amy was not a function of James's perfect world, not a stay-at-home mom who takes care of the 5 cats. She was just Amy. But the more they got to know each other, the more eager they were to see each other in person. This was not just a digital fantasy. It was real, and it had breached the walls of James's control. The detectives' scrolling stopped. They had found what they were looking for. Had they ever met Amy in person? Yes, twice. The first time the two met up was in the spring of 2017. It was simple. It was, on the surface, innocent. They met to grab some coffee. For Amy, a woman who had been systematically isolated from her own family, whose every move was tracked by her husband, this simple act was a profound rebellion. It was a few hours of feeling normal, of sitting across from someone who was not her auditor. The second time was several months later. The messages leading up to it were filled with a nervous, palpable energy. George was here, in the area, for work. He was at a hotel. Amy had some free time. She went to the hotel. The detectives read the messages from after the meeting. The tone had shifted. The connection had been solidified. When asked about it, George's own words would confirm the investigators' suspicions. When asked if things that happen at a hotel happened at that hotel, his answer was simple. Some things. Yes, the emotional affair had become a physical one. It was the ultimate act of betrayal against James's suffocating ownership. Amy had not just shared her mind. She had shared her body, the one thing James thought he still exclusively possessed. And apparently, George and Amy's love for each other only grew as time went on. This was not a fleeting encounter that left her full of guilt. It was a catalyst. It was proof that another life was possible. Even on the day of her death, Amy showed no signs of wanting to slow down. Her last conversation with George was not one of remorse. It was one of anticipation. "I love you," he had written. "I want more of you." "I love you, too," she had replied, just hours before James would find her. "I'm ready to spend time with you in person." "Good. Let's do it." Amy had a plan. She wrote, "End of October." George's reply was simple, and for the detectives, it was the final, tragic note in a 3-year symphony of escape. "I'm in." Amy was not just having an affair. She was planning a future. And her husband, the man who policed her every move, had just discovered it. The timeline was now the only thing that mattered. The detectives had the pieces. They had the cold house. They had the low ceiling. They had the controlling husband. And they had the wife's secret world. Now, they looked back at James's story of the night, and his meticulous narrative fell apart. He had told them the argument at the bar, JR's hometown grill and pub, was about selling the house and moving down south. He had painted it as a simple disagreement, a minor friction in an otherwise perfect life. He claimed Amy had become dismissive, that she had started texting someone. The detectives now knew this was the most crucial lie. They could see the scene. James, the type, a personality, the man who believed he was at the pinnacle of his life, laying out his plans. And Amy, sitting next to him, was not just dismissive. She was gone. She was in a different world, a secret one, texting the man she was planning to meet, the man she loved. The argument was not about moving south. The argument was about the phone. He must have glanced over. He must have seen the screen. In that one catastrophic moment, James Allen, the man who monitored his wife's every move, would have seen the name. He would have seen the words. He would have seen "I love you," or "I'm excited to see you," or "I want more of you." He would have seen, in that instant, that his control was a complete illusion. By the time they left the bar, James had said things were very tense. This was, the detectives now understood, a profound understatement. He had just learned his perfect, introverted, incapable wife was not only having an affair, but was in love and was making plans. Amy decided she would rather walk home. James had framed this as her being stubborn. The detectives now saw it as an act of desperation. She was fleeing. The surveillance footage confirmed it. Amy walking down the street, alone, heading in the direction of their house. James driving, alone, in their car. Amy arrived home at 7:58 in the evening. She was, for a few precious moments, alone in the house. At 8:05 in the evening, James's own timeline confirmed he went to check on her. He told the officers he found her in the basement. He claimed the argument resumed, but that it was about something trivial. She was angry at him for slamming the door in her face as they left the bar, his own statement read. He claimed he had forgotten to hold it for her. This was the lie that proved his guilt. The detectives knew he had not followed her to the basement to argue about a door. He had followed her to the basement to confront her about George. He had followed her to the basement to confront her about the hotel, about the texts, about the end of October. He had followed her to the furthest, most isolated part of the house, to the room with the low ceiling, to demand an answer. He had followed her to stop her from leaving. The argument that happened in that room was not about a door. It was about the affair. It was about the end of his world. And it was the moment the detectives knew that the argument had become physical. It was the moment James, having lost every other form of control, had resorted to the final, most permanent one. That flicker of life, the one that had caused James such visible frustration, was now all that remained of Amy. She was in the hospital, unresponsive. The faint pulse the EMS had found was a fragile thing, now held captive by the steady, metronomic breathing of machines. She was in a space between worlds, her body still present, but her mind, herself, was gone. The vigil began. James was present, as he had to be. He was the husband. He sat in the sterile hallways. He stood by the doorway. He played the part of the man shattered by a terrible tragedy. But he was not the only one there. Amy's family arrived. Her parents, the ones she had been forbidden from speaking to. Her son, Caleb, the young man who had fled James's control. They had been cut off from her for over a year, and now, the first time they were allowed to see her, she was like this. Their grief was not the performative, shirt-ripping display James had offered. It was a cold, silent, bottomless ocean of rage and despair. They were all trapped there, in that awful, quiet place, for 3 days. It was a cold war in a waiting room. Amy's family watched James. They watched the man who had waited 14 hours to tell them their daughter was dying. They watched as he put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. They watched his dry sobs. And they, and the detectives who were quietly monitoring the situation, watched his mask slip. James, the man who was supposedly hoping his wife would wake up, seemed to take pride in this toxic behavior, framing it as a strength even in his grief. He believed that his role, even here, was to hold him to a higher standard. His phone would vibrate. He would look at it, and the grief would vanish, switched off like a light. He would stand, walk into the hallway, and his voice would become crisp, clear, and professional. He was taking business calls. He was discussing logistics. He was managing his assets. He was, in the middle of this profound human tragedy, maintaining the pinnacle of the life he had built. He would conclude a call, his tone efficient and decisive, slip the phone into his pocket, and re-enter the waiting area. The mask of the broken husband would slide back down, his shoulders would slump, and the dry sobs would resume. This continued for 3 days. 3 days of the machines breathing for her. 3 days of her family staring at the man they believed had done this. 3 days of James Allen managing his portfolio. On the 3rd day, the medical staff, their faces grim and tired, emerged. There was no more debate. There was no flicker. The faint pulse had been an echo, and the machines were now the only thing creating the illusion of life. She had been unresponsive for too long. On September 17th, 2018, after being unresponsive for 3 days, Amy was taken off of life support. She was pronounced dead. The case was no longer an assault. It was no longer a mysterious incident. It was now, officially, a homicide investigation. With Amy's death, the case was now officially a homicide investigation. But a label did not mean a solution. The detectives had the motive, locked away in her cell phone. They had the suspicious behavior, witnessed by officers and family. They had the physical impossibility of the room, noted by Officer Horn. But they were missing the bridge. They were missing the definitive, physical proof that separated their theory from James's story. The police struggled to find any new leads. James, they learned, was no longer in the state. He had returned to Florida. The investigation, which had begun with such frantic, strange energy, now went cold. Then, 3 months after Amy's death, the day finally came. The medical examiner released Amy's autopsy report. The detectives read it with a familiar mix of anticipation and frustration. It was a document of contradictions. It confirmed the cause of death: strangulation, asphyxiation. The faint mark near her jugular, the one Horn had seen, was the only external sign of the catastrophic internal damage. But the report failed on the most crucial point. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. It required additional investigation. The report was a setback. It confirmed what had happened to Amy. She had been strangled, but it could not, or would not, determine who had done it. It left the door open, just wide enough, for James's story to remain a possibility, however remote. The ball was back in the investigators' court, but the local police department had limited personnel and resources. The case was complex, and James was out of state. The Michigan State Police had now taken over the investigation, and Detective Larry Rothman was put on the case. Rothman was a meticulous man. He did not appreciate ambiguity. An undetermined manner of death was, to him, a challenge. He began his work not by looking for new evidence, but by meticulously looking through all of the old evidence. He read James's statements. He read the family's statements. He studied the digital history between Amy and George. And then, he sat down to watch the bodycam footage from the very first night. He watched the chaotic, jerky footage from Officer Horn's perspective. He saw James sobbing, the ripped shirt, the dry tears. He heard the strange, sudden rage in the kitchen. And then, he stumbled upon the moment. He watched as Officer Horn, in the quiet of the basement after Amy had been taken away, looked up. He heard Horn's partner confirm the observation. The low ceilings. Rothman paused the footage. He looked at the image on the screen, the dimensions of the small, cramped room. He thought about James's story. He thought about the upturned pail. He thought about Amy's height, 5 feet, 6 inches. He thought about the ceiling, roughly 7 feet. He suddenly had an idea. It was an idea born of pure, logical frustration. Finding more evidence to determine whether or not this was a homicide was easier said than done. James was in Florida. The scene was cold. But the physics had not changed. Rothman reached out to a forensic engineering lab in Michigan. He asked them if they could recreate the scenario. He wanted to take James's story, the one he had told the police, and test it. He wanted to know, scientifically, if it was even possible. The lab agreed. Rothman gave them the data. He gave them the exact model of extension cord. He gave them Amy's approximate weight at the time of her death, 140 pounds. He gave them the dimensions of the room, the height of the pail. After many months of preparation, The testing began. They would analyze the results. They would determine with the certainty of physics if, under the same circumstances, her feet would have made contact with the ground. The investigation was no longer just a theory. It had become an experiment. The experiment was complete. The forensic engineering lab in Michigan had spent many months of preparation, testing, and analyzing the results. The report that landed on Detective Rothman's desk was not a theory. It was a document of pure physics, and it was a bombshell. The lab determined that under the same circumstances James had supposedly stumbled upon, his story was an impossibility. The extension cord, the one he had claimed Amy used, could not have supported her weight. And, most critically, given the low ceiling of the basement and the height of the upturned pail, her feet would have made contact with the ground. This report was the additional investigation the original autopsy had called for. Rothman, now armed with this definitive scientific evidence, took the findings to a different forensic pathologist. This new expert reviewed the same test results from the engineering lab, compared them with the original autopsy, and studied the photographs of the faint, subtle mark near Amy's jugular. Their conclusion was swift and certain. The ambiguity was gone. They determined that her manner of death must have been a homicide. The undetermined label, the one that had protected James for so long, was officially erased. On October 16, 2020, armed with the new pathologist's report, the state of Michigan formally charged James Allen with one felony count of open murder. This meant that if the case went to trial, it would be up to the jury to determine the degree of homicide he was guilty of, anywhere from involuntary manslaughter to first-degree murder. By this point in the investigation, it appeared that James, who was still staying with his parents in Florida, had moved on entirely. The man who had performed his grief with such dramatic, dry sobs had successfully rebuilt his life. He had, the investigators learned, done so with the same efficiency and control with which he had managed everything else. In fact, he even had a new fiancée. Their wedding, a new beginning, a celebration of a new, perfect life, was just 5 days away. But before they could tie the knot, the past that James had fled in Michigan finally caught up with him in Florida. Before he could walk down the aisle to start his new life, James was arrested by authorities. He was taken into custody and extradited back to Michigan to face the charge. His new life was over. His old one had just caught up. Once James was booked into jail, he was brought into a room to have his charges explained to him. He was a man who had, for 2 years, controlled the narrative, moved to another state, and nearly started a brand new life. Now, he was in a small room, his future 5 days from a wedding, now indefinitely postponed. When he was told that he could contact the investigators if he had any questions, James, the man who had ripped his shirt off and cried dry tears, said something peculiar. "If you have any, questions," the officer said, "feel free to get a hold of us." James looked at the men who had dismantled his new life. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet, almost arrogant. "This is how you sleep at night." The officer was stunned. "Well, I guess I don't understand that question," he replied. "Okay." A few weeks later, at his arraignment hearing, James pleaded not guilty. His bond was set at $10 million, and he was put behind bars. Leading up to his trial, his defense attorney, Daniel Garin, released a statement. It was defiant. Mr. Allen vehemently asserts his innocence in this case, as he had absolutely nothing to do with Amy Allen's tragic death. He cooperated with police throughout the 2-year investigation and provided evidence and statements showing his innocence from the very beginning. He has been in jail for nearly a year for a crime he did not commit, and he misses his family dearly. He is looking forward to the evidence finally being shown to a jury of his peers, so they can see clearly that he is innocent and did absolutely nothing wrong. In September of 2021, 3 years after Amy's death, his trial began. Prosecutor Angie Borders kicked off the opening statements. She said that her team was confident that the evidence, the motive, the control, the physics would point the jury to a guilty verdict. Then, Daniel Garin delivered the defense's opening statement. He said that there was no substantial evidence to support the prosecution's theory. and their case did not add up. The people want you to believe that Jimmy Allen, for reasons nobody explains or guesses or understands why, snaps after 15 years of marriage, brutally silences his wife, goes up into cover-up mode, and then gets the police there at 8:52 to start showing them evidence of this. They also pointed to James's search history that night, suggesting that murder was the last thing on his mind. The phone searches they get from Jimmy's phone shows that he's looking at searches for Jim Carrey movies and other Showtime shows, the exact shows that he had told police that night that he had watched. The battle lines were drawn. Was he a cold, calculating man or a grieving husband, innocently watching a movie whose life was destroyed by a tragedy he did not cause? The prosecution began to build its case, not with physics, but with emotion. One of the key witnesses was Amy's son, Caleb. He took the stand, a young man who had lost his mother, and told the court about an altercation with James while he still lived at home. "I stood up, pushed him against the wall," Caleb said, his voice shaking but steady, and there was a second of fear that came over me, and I realized what I was doing, and I let up. And then I was spun around, and then I was choked from behind on the floor for multiple seconds. It felt like forever, and I was gasping for air, grabbing for anything, trying to get away from him. The story hung in the courtroom. It suggested that James had a history of choking people when he got angry. If he was willing to do that to Caleb, the prosecution argued, he was willing to do it to Amy. Several witnesses that were at the scene that night were also called to the stand, including first responders and neighbors. They all testified that James's over-the-top reactions, the wailing, the ripped shirt, seemed like he was putting on an act. His behavior, captured on bodycam, supported this. There were several moments shown to the jury where he would be sobbing uncontrollably. "This is terrible," only to instantly compose himself, his voice flat and calm, to answer the officer's questions. Officer Horn also noted that Amy's injuries did not align with James's story. "You know, I was definitely looking for any injuries, and I really didn't see any sort of the typical injuries that I would have seen. So, I definitely took note of that." Later, a hospital staff member that treated Amy agreed, saying the lack of visible injuries was a red flag. But the prosecution's star witness was one that nobody, especially James, had ever expected to see. The mystery man, George. He took the stand. "Was there occasion where you came to know somebody being on the internet?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," George said. "We spoke online often. We talked about life, but we also, there was a little bit of sexual content. It's what we talked about." He confirmed they had met in person twice. The second time, in a hotel room. "I was here for work, and she had some free time, so she came to the hotel," he said. "Did things that happen at a hotel happen at that hotel?" "Some things, yes." George testified that their love for each other only grew, and on the day of her death, Amy showed no signs of wanting to slow down. He read their final text to the court. "I wrote, 'I love you,' and I wrote, 'I want more of you.' And she wrote, 'I love you too. I'm ready to spend time with you in person.' And I wrote, 'Good, let's do it.' And then, she wrote, 'End of October.' And I wrote, 'I'm in.' Amy had a plan to live." The prosecution rested, having shown the jury that James had the motive to stop her. Dr. Elizabeth Buck, the prosecution's forensic expert, played a crucial role. During her testimony, she took the jury through the extension cord experiment we mentioned earlier. The first question that Detective Rothman asked was, "Can an extension cord suspend 140 pounds?" she explained. The testing was performed. The answer is no. The results were clear. James's story was not just unlikely. It was, according to science, impossible. When it was the defense's turn, they called James's father to testify. He tried to explain why James had left the state. It was not, he claimed, because he was guilty. It was because James's family urged him to stay with them in Florida. He seemed somewhat composed, but totally shattered, his father said. Almost empty, if you would. He seemed to have lost interest in anything. Then, The defense called Ashley, James's daughter, to the stand. Her testimony was the defense's own bombshell. The day after the incident, 3 years prior, she had told officers that her mother had always been stable. But now, 3 years later, her story had completely changed. Did you notice anything, behaviors or issues that you saw when your mom was drinking alcohol? The defense attorney asked. Two things. Yes, Ashley said. My mother overindulged in alcohol frequently and she became intoxicated very easily, which would cause her to be not herself at all. She would be, meaner and more violent. The defense used this to paint a new picture of Amy. When Amy was placed under intensive care, her blood alcohol content was recorded at 0.09%, likely from the drinks that night. The defense said this was proof of Amy's drinking problem, that she wasn't as stable as the prosecution suggested. To dispute the science, the defense had reached out to their own expert, Dr. Francisco J. Diaz. According to Dr. Diaz, since there was minimal bleeding to the strap muscles of the neck, no petechiae, and no evidence of defensive-type injuries, he believed that Amy's death was not the result of somebody else's actions. The defense had called all of their witnesses. The battle was between physics and psychology, between a controlling husband and a violent, unstable woman. The defense had a lot more to say in their closing arguments. They said that the prosecution's case was utter speculation, and the fact that James had 0 defensive marks on him, they argued, was proof of that. Anyone puts you in a chokehold, you're going to scratch the you-know-what out of his arms, because you're fighting for life. You're fighting for that air hunger and you're trying to stay alive. They also said that even though Amy and George's relationship seemed to be flourishing, it was actually just a fantasy. It was an escape from the dejected state of mind that plagued Amy's life. You know, the people want to say this was sort of this thing she was looking forward to break free, Garin argued. It was 3 years, and they have 3 years to meet, and they meet one time for 2 hours. He painted a picture of Amy that James had long curated. She was not talking to her family. She was isolated. She didn't have a job. She was socially anxious. And that is not to beat up Amy Allen. It is to tell you that she was living sort of a double parallel life. And we believe the fuse was lit. And we had, unfortunately, isolation, drinking, odd behavior, the guilt of a very graphic and long-term affair unbeknownst to Jimmy, that ultimately led to her very sad and tragic death on Friday, September 14th of 2018. Both sides rested their case. James's fate was now in the hands of the jury. After about 6 hours of deliberations, they had their verdict. The courtroom was silent. You do say upon your oath that you find the defendant guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder. After this verdict, James didn't seem to know what to do with himself. He wandered aimlessly for a bit, and when it was time to be booked into the jail, the man who had shown such rage and such performative grief simply turned to his family, who had supported him, and he bashfully waved goodbye. On October 21st, 2021, James was sentenced to 20 to 45 years in prison in the Michigan Department of Corrections. He currently resides at the St. Louis Correctional Facility and will be eligible for parole in the year 2040. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this complex and tragic case. We appreciate you spending your time with us. Until next time, stay safe.